In this video, I'm going to talk a bit about prefabs, tilefabs, what's the difference, and why would you use one instead of the other. Just to get started, let's draw out a simple array of tiles, standard Unity tiles, on the screen, rather the scene view, and we'll switch to our project, use a new folder, and we'll just drag this in here. Standard Unity prefab. You want to drop it in the scene. There it is. One thing you've noticed here is we now have two grids. Perhaps you have a use case where you have a grid with some child tile maps and you'd like to be able to add and delete tiles from it programmatically. You can't really use a prefab because it just instantiates a new grid every time. Now you can create a prefab just out of a single tile map and instantiate it under a grid, but still you'll be adding another tile map. May not necessarily work. For my situation, what I was trying to do in my own project, it wouldn't work. Now let's just delete these and we'll get rid of this. We'll get rid of this by uncoupling it from prefab, unpack completely, and let's get rid of this because we don't need it. Okay, now let's use TilePlus Painter, and on another tile map here, we'll add a few simple TilePlus tiles. Just a few. There's one. There's one. There's another one. We'll add a spawner. So we've added a few here. Now, what happens now if you try and drag and drop this into a folder? You're going to get a message, undoing changes to prefab grid, and if this was a drag drop from scene to project, unlinking source scene objects. Please read the user guide. Now, if you try and drag in this prefab, you'll see the TilePlus tiles do not show a sprite. As a matter of fact, if you look in TilePlus Painter, and you'll see there's actually no sprites. That's because these are just ordinary tile assets at this point, because the TilePlus tiles are scene objects and you cannot save them into a prefab. Since you can't actually create a prefab this way, the system software unlinks the prefab that was created from this original grid so that the tiles in here are not corrupted. So what do you do in this case? Well, it's pretty easy, but let's go back a second and get rid of some of this stuff. We don't need this, and we don't need this. In the TilePlus universe, you create a Tilefab. We've talked about Tilefabs in a few other videos, but basically a Tilefab is a reference to one or more tile bundles for each tile map that's archived. And a tile bundle is an archive of all the tiles on a particular tile map and any child game objects for that tile map's game object, which is a confusing way to put it. The way you do that at the most basic level is, we'll go back to our project, is you go to select the grid, go to Tools, TilePlus, Prefabs, Bundle Tile Maps. Go to Samples, new folder, select the folder. Wants to know if you want to make a prefab. Well, let's say yes. Bundled 54 tiles for 4 tile maps. Continue. Now what have we got? We've got a Tilefab for the floor layer and the effects layer. And we've got our tile bundles for each individual tile map. And we have something called a grid bundle. This is a prefab of just the grid and something called a prefab marker. We could take a quick look at that in code for a second. So here's a reference to the Tilefab that was just created. That's populated by the bundler when you use it. And there's this simple function here that just loads the Tilefab for you. If you look at the effects layer, you'll see that as a sub-object, it has the TilePlus tiles saved as assets. If you look at these and you look at the basic settings, you'll see they are locked. Locked means that the system, in other words, the TilePlus system, will actively try and stop you from modifying these tiles. So if we load in the grid bundle, there it is again. If we look at Painter, you'll notice it says NZ. Let's take a look at the location. That's because the transform of the grid and or the tile map is not 0. If you were to put these back to 0, then the NZ would go away. It's more of a warning to yourself. But we can see if we look at the these are perfectly fine. You'll notice though that it warns you it's in a prefab, don't edit these. And instead of showing you fields, that's to prevent you from changing them. It just shows the status of the fields, basically. This is true for any type of tile plus tile. It really won't let you modify it. There is a setting that lets you modify things in prefabs in case you want to. If you modify tile plus tiles in a prefab and you save the overrides, the prefab will become useless because these assets here will become corrupted. So the system tries to prevent you from doing it. You can manage to finagle your way around it. It won't work. However, that doesn't really eliminate the problem of we have two grids. What if you wanted to put these tiles that were archived here and just put them on these other tile maps? In other words, addition kind of. Well, we know we can do that with Painter. So if we go to Painter and we look at Tilefabs, this Tilefab, this is the one we just made. If we paint it, you'll notice no new grid is added. If we look at the original effects layer, we notice now we have 2 of each kind of tile. That's because we've added them. If we were to erase, which we can do fairly easily by drawing out a marquee and making that a grid selection and clearing the map here, you'll notice when we go back, there's really only just one. So we can add and subtract tiles without having to establish another grid. It's really very easy. So if your use case is you'd like to add and subtract tiles from existing tile maps, it's much easier to use Tilefabs than prefabs because you don't have to worry about parenting objects from loose prefabs of just tile maps to the appropriate grid. It just sort of works automatically. So let's delete these things and clear this because we don't need it anymore. And we'll talk about another use for these. But one use case that's possible is you might have a situation where you have a player moving around, let's say in a top-down view, and it's a very large area, but you want to have floor always showing under the player. However, you don't want to populate the entire level with those tiles. Maybe it's a really big level. If you populate, let's say, something that's 1,000 by 1,000 with tiles, that's an awful lot of tiles. It'd be much better just to populate the area within the camera view and have those tiles added and deleted. It's also a lot easier to accomplish that if rather than do it one tile at a time, you do groups of tiles. That's where the Tilefabs really come in handy. I'm not going to really go through that in great detail. I would suggest that you take a look at TilePlus Extras, Tilefab Demos, Chunking. There's a whole demo, and we'll take a quick look at what this does. Pull up the game view too, because we'll want to look at that. So we've got two grids, a background grid and a main grid, a camera and a game controller. Now let's take a quick look at the game controller. So what have we got? These two mysterious looking things called zone layouts and a controller. The controller doesn't really do an awful lot. It's similar to the controllers for top-down demo and a few other things. It just lets you move a character around on a tile map. What TP Zone Layout does is to monitor the area where the camera is, the camera view area to be specific, and it works with other software such as Zone Manager Lib and Tilefab Lib to figure out how many tilefabs of a particular size will fit into the camera view, and it will automatically add them when there's empty areas found, and it will automatically delete them when tilefabs that were placed previously move out of the camera view. It's very difficult to explain this in a video. Important things to notice are chunk size. We've talked about that before. You've seen it when you look at TilePlus Painter and you go into the chunk snapping mode, chunk size. Again, we're working with this larger grid. However, you might notice here the chunk size or the larger grid size is 4. So this one particular layout works with tilefabs that are 4 by 4. In other words, total of 16 tiles arranged 4 by 4. There's a zone manager name. Those are instances, and they have particular names they're identified by. Here, there's another zone manager. This one is on 16 by 16. In the demo, there's active Boolean switches here. Just for right now, to make it a little easier to understand, I'm only going to have the smaller chunk size chunks be actively added and removed. Show camera rec means as the system computes where to add and delete tiles from, it'll draw little rectangles as a debugging guide. And it's nice to leave in. It only shows up in the scene view in any case. So let's run play and see what happens. So we've got some zones that are empty, as we saw in the filter, does that automatically. Here is the camera view. We'll just keep that selected so it moves around, and we'll move our player around a bit. We have to click in the scene window for that. So I'll move our player around. Let me just make that smaller, and you can see the little rectangles are the subdivision of the area. And you'll see as the camera view moves around, tiles are added and subtracted, and the padding makes sure that the camera view never actually gets to an area that hasn't been dealt with yet. Finally, let's enable both at the same time. You actually can have both of these running at the same time if you like. And you can see if we move around, both of these layouts are working at the same time. This demo is a really good example of how to use chunking, and it's also a really good example of where tilefabs are superior to prefabs. You can't really do something like this easily, or this easily, as you can with tilefabs.